I'm Paul Erickson. I'm the director of the Clements Library, and I'd like to thank all of you for braving the weather this afternoon to join us. Let's take a moment to show our appreciation for the beautiful harp music during today's reception, performed by Clements Fellow Alex Ames. Alex is a visiting research fellow at the Clements Library and is an artist in residence this week. So if you'd like to hear more from Alex and see some items highlighting the cultural resonances of the harp in 19th century America, please visit his pop-up exhibit this week at the Clements. We're open from 12 to 4 for anybody who would like to view the exhibit. Thank you for joining us for this afternoon's program titled A Conflict of Emotions, Thomas and Margaret Gage and the American Revolution. We'll have 3 speakers this afternoon, followed by a question and answer session. For the Q&A portion of the program, you have all been provided with index cards. If you didn't get an index card, please raise your hand and someone will provide you with one. Please write down any questions you have for the presenters on the index cards. Staff will be available to collect your questions and they will hand them to me, and then I will moderate the Q&A. Now, I am absolutely delighted to welcome Deborah Gage to Ann Arbor tonight. Deborah is an international dealer and consultant in the global arts market who divides her time between Europe and the US. She has curated numerous exhibitions and lectures widely on both sides of the Atlantic. She's also the founder of the Charleston Trust in England, which was established in 1980 to save Charleston Farmhouse, which is on the Furrow Estate in Sussex. Furrow Place, the manor house on the estate, is the ancestral home of the Gage family and has been in the family since 1497. Deborah's been involved in caring for the estate's collection of paintings and decorative arts and looking after the archives for the past 58 years. Her interest in her ancestor, General Thomas Gage, and his wife, Margaret Kemble, is what brings her here today. Following Deborah will be Mary Pedley, who's the adjunct map curator at the Clements Library. Many of you will know Mary from her many years teaching Latin in the Ann Arbor Public Schools, but she is also one of the world's leading experts on 18th century European cartography, and we're delighted to have her as a colleague at the Clements. And then following Mary will be Cheney Choperet, the curator of manuscripts at the Clements Library. In that role, Cheney is responsible for the care of the Thomas Gage papers and has had the lead role in the project to digitize the papers with the support of a grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities. May it rest in peace. One of the most common old saws about the difference between the United States and England is that in the United States, 100 years is considered to be a long time, and in England, 100 miles is considered to be a long way. I was reminded of this distinction last week when I was on vacation with my family in Big Bend in West Texas, in Brewster County, a county that is on its own larger than all of Northern Ireland and 75% the size of Wales. So we Americans often tend to think of England as a cozy little island compared to the vast continental expanses of the United States. But Thomas Gage is a figure who gives the lie to that conception. So he was born and died in the south of England in a relatively, in places that are relatively near each other, but his military career took him from Belgium and the Low Countries to Scotland and then to Canada and the American colonies. During his service in the 7 Years' War, he was sent as far west as Pittsburgh as part of the Braddock Expedition, which was followed by a set of promotions that saw him in 1763 be appointed Commander-in-Chief of Britain's forces in North America. You'll be hearing more about his life during the program, so I will just note that during this life that began and ended in places relatively near each other, he saw a tremendous amount of the world and lived a truly remarkable life. And I'm looking forward to learning more about it. So please join me in welcoming Deborah Gage.
Testing. Can you hear us?
Yep.
Yeah? Okay. Just get close to it.
Lovely. Thank you very much. Get close to it. Good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to say it means a great deal to be here. And before I start my lecture, I'd particularly like to thank Paul Erickson for the extraordinarily warm and generous welcome. And Helen Harding, who organized my trip superbly. But in particular, I'd like to say one of the best parts about being an art historian is collaboration. And I've had the best time working with Mary and Cheney. we've had such fun with our Zoom talks. We've shared a lot of information. Mary's found a wonderful 1744 map for me, which I will be showing. But it's really been a very special time, and this is the fulfillment of our conversations. Showing on the screen is the drawing room at Firle Place, which is, as Paul mentioned, our family ancestral home. And we're gathered in Ann Arbor today, essentially, to celebrate the digitalization of the Gage papers by the William Clemens Library, home of the largest archive in the United States of manuscripts and maps relating to the British conduct of the American War of Independence, as well as documents pertaining to the American side of the conflict. And I have to say, the last few days that I've spent with the team working on the papers, it has been an amazingly exciting project, and you should all be incredibly proud that it's happening here in Ann Arbor. As you have gathered, I am a descendant of General Thomas Gage, Commander-in-Chief of the British forces in the 13 colonies of North America between 1763 until the advent of the War of Independence in 1775. But my relationship with General Gage is not just through blood, rather my journey to come to know him through archival material and the realization through my relatives, Thomas and Margaret, showing on either side of the fireplace, that their story was a rubric that resonated at the time upon everyone within the colonies and Europe. Now, can I make this work? No. We've got a problem.
Is it not working? Oh dear. Oh, I see. Okay, we've got to get rid of that.
There, try now.
Next slide.
I think we're better with this.
I think we'll use the mouse.
Pardon me,
Yeah.
could you put the microphone down a little bit?
Oh, yeah, there.
And then maybe get a little bit closer.
Great.
There it is.
There, yep. Okay, I think you need to go back one.
Is that the right one?
That's the right one.
Okay.
Thank you. There. Yep. Put it right up. So, a little about our two protagonists. Thomas Gage was born in 1721 and grew up at his family home, High Meadow in Gloucestershire, though Firle Place in East Sussex had been the established Gage family seat since the 15th century. The family remained staunchly Catholic to their cost until 1715, when they conformed to the Church of England. Thomas's father was raised to the peerage as First Viscount Gage in 1720, inheriting Firle in 1774. Thomas was sent to Westminster School. He grew up disciplined and hardworking, ambitious, prudent, upright, and well-meaning. As a second son, under the system of primogeniture, which I'm sure you will all know is the feudal right of succession in respect of an entire estate, I got it. There.
I'll be glad to do the slides.
Would you?
If you want.
Okay, that way.
Just give me
I'll give you a signal.
little-
Right, we need the next slide. Thank you. So it's the feudal right of succession in respect of an entire estate, titles, etc., passing on to the firstborn son. Effectively meant that Thomas would inherit nothing, leaving two choices of occupation, the church or the army. He became a seasoned soldier, witnessing some of the most gruesome battles of his time. He was present at the British defeat at Fontenoy in 1745, one of the bloodiest conflicts of the 18th century, and brutality beyond description. A year later in Scotland, he was on the winning side of the Battle of Culloden in 1746. Could I have the next slide? Thank you. Another epic slaughter. In 1754, Thomas was posted to North America, where he commanded the vanguard of Braddock's expedition against the French and Indians in the Ohio Valley during the 7 Years' War. On July 9th, the force blindly marched into a forest ambush near Fort Duquesne, were nearly annihilated, and Braddock was killed. True to form, Gage conducted himself in combat with courage. Wounded himself, he improvised a rear guard that allowed the escape of George Washington, his fellow brother officer. To secure a permanent colony for himself, also to meet the peculiar conditions of warfare in the woods, which the British were not used to, Thomas raised a new type of regiment in 1775 called the 80th Foot, or Gage's Light Armed Infantry. It came to be designated as a landmark in military history, for he had organized the first definitely light-armed regiment in the British Army, dressed in brown camouflage coats with black buttons. Gage departed for Brunswick, now New Brunswick in New Jersey, to set up a recruiting headquarters. Thomas did not go there purely for military purposes. His main objective was to spend Christmas with the Peter Kemble family at their home, Mount Kemble in Morristown. Thomas was taken by Peter's daughter, Margaret. They married on December 8th, 1758. The Gages moved to Albany, where Thomas assumed an important new command of the capital and all the forts in the area. Next. Meanwhile, William Pitt, the English Prime Minister, pressed the impetus to shatter French Canada. General James Wolfe was given instructions to assail Quebec. It took 2 attempts. Wolfe was killed at the first, and I was very excited to see the version of this hanging here at the Clements Library. General Amherst succeeded with the second, and the Marquis de Vaudreuil, the French governor of Canada, surrendered on September 8th, 1760. The French troops returned to their mother country, while Amherst arranged for military governments. James Murray continued in command in Quebec. Gage was made the first British governor of Montreal. Thomas proved himself a competent administrator. Tact and wisdom were the hallmarks of his 3-year tenure, despite the tensions that prevailed, since the Quebec Act required Canadians to give up their oath to the French king and Catholicism. Also, Gage's first child, Henry, was born on the 4th March, 1761, and their daughter Maria Theresa in 1762. Thomas was elevated to a major general in the same year, while in the spring of 1763, news came to Canada of definitive peace, the Treaty of Paris that gave Canada to Britain, as well as India, an auspicious trading opportunity. Gage succeeded to the Supreme Command, arriving in New York City on 16th of November, 1763. By June 1764, the Gages had moved into a house on Broad Street, which became the center of all British activities in America for the next 9 years. The Gages were famous throughout the colonies for their conjugal felicity and led New York society in style and fashion and the making of the New World. They entertained liberally to meet all the distinguished visitors in town, including the great Cherokee chiefs Attakullakulla and Okonotoshah. Thomas was modest, diffident, good-natured, and generous. The new commander was far more attractive and approachable than the haughty, imperious, and taciturn Amherst. Margaret, though occupied with the birth of 4 more children in the New York years, was an engaging hostess. She was 1/4 English, 1/4 Greek, 1/4 Dutch, and 1/4 French. Sensitive and exquisite, possessing charm rather than statuesque looks, with large dark eyes. Margaret's father was the Honorable Peter Kemble, one of the wealthiest men in Morris County, New Jersey, a staunch Tory and loyalist who at the time was the presiding officer of the Royal Council in New Jersey. His father had been a merchant in Turkey, in the city of Smyrna, where Peter's mother came from and was a Greek. Peter came to New York in 1730. His first marriage was to Gertrude Bayard of the Van Cortlandt family, one of the most extensive and aristocratic landowners in the Hudson Valley. Next. Van Cortlandt offspring married into several of the other valley's leading scions, such as the Livingstons. Margaret's first cousin, Peter Van Cortlandt's marriage to Joanna Livingston, united two of the valley's most elite lineages, as well as the Schuylers and the Delanceys, many of whom held high offices in New York Colony and became close friends as well as relatives of the Gages. A striking illustration of the intimate as well as wide kinship of the foremost New York and First Empire families on the eastern seaboard that politically and socially proved such a force in the colony. Thomas Gage's finances increased during his American service. As Commander-in-Chief, he received £10 a day, no mean sum then. He was also paid the salary of a colonel. He retained the command of one regiment or the other from 1757 until his death. Always thinking how best to provide for his family, 10 surviving children, he obtained 18,000 acres of land on the 6th of July, 1769, costing approximately £100 near Albany by the Mohawk River in what is now Oneida County in New York State, from land ceded as part of the 1768 treaty from the Six Nation Indians. He also acquired a plantation in Montserrat, West Indies, that brought in an income of £600 a year. Under the system of primogeniture, Thomas would not have had such an opportunity in England. Now, a property owner, he had a vested interest in the future of his family in America. Thomas worked faithfully to support the King and Parliament, at the same time as seeking to bring about harmony and, importantly, prosperity for the colonists. Next. When Gage was confirmed in his position as Commander-in-Chief in 1763, his responsibilities were enormous. He was in charge of a vast military machine with more than 50 garrisons to hold fast, stretching from Newfoundland down to Florida and from Bermuda across to Mississippi. He had to preserve a vast domain from danger, whether from Spanish attack, an attempt by the French to rebuild their empire, or Indian uprisings. However, the fact was that the English had taken on too much land. This was highlighted to me during a conversation with Andrew Shaughnessy, author of The Men Who Lost America. Essentially, they had bitten off more than they could chew, especially given that simultaneously Britain was also involved in a global imperial war that had great consequences against France, Spain, and even the Dutch Republic, without any allies and deep political divisions at home. Indeed, O'Shaughnessy opined that had the American Revolutionary War not taken place, perhaps the colonies might have developed into a Commonwealth nation. British politicians had been concerned both by the huge cost of fighting the 7 Years' War, as well as continuing to provide protection for the colonies, weighed against the fact that the national debt in Britain was at an all-time high of £130 million, a staggering sum in those days. Why should the Americans not carry some of the burden for the cost of the future? This resulted in the Stamp Act crisis in November 1765 and its repeal in March 1766, which was to be Gage's first real brush with mob rebuttal. Next. John Singleton Copley's portrait of General Gage was undertaken during a Boston visit in November 1768. Its composition points to an intentional collaboration between the artist and Thomas Gage in the creation of an explicit and politicized statement. The intended audience being the rebellious citizenry of the colonies, in which the general, as the senior representative of the Crown in North America, held military command. Gage points emphatically to a graphic warning of the dire consequences of further unlawful resistance to the rule of the Crown and Parliament. Thomas is portrayed leaning on a wooden baton while pointing to the background. His head is turned to face and engage the viewer with a direct gaze. The pictorial convention of 18th century portraits of army commanders held that when a military scene is depicted, it was understood to represent a prominent episode in the sitter's career. The brutal suppression of the 1745 Jacobite rebellion in the Scottish Highlands concluded at the Battle of Culloden in 1746, when the Jacobite forces were utterly destroyed following a notoriously harsh pacification campaign directed by the British Army against the civilian population of the Scottish Highlands. Copley effectively served Gage's political purposes by pictorially signaling Gage's warning to his American audience. There would have been no mistaking General Gage's implicit warning. I'm grateful to Christopher Bryant pointing out this iconographic relevance to me. Next. As a historian, on occasion, I believe it's essential to walk through history to achieve a better grasp of a train of events. This became evident when my cousin, the 8th Viscount Gage, and head of the family, together with myself, were invited to participate in the reenactment of the 225th anniversary of the skirmishes of Lexington and Concord in April 2000. Many of the reenactors were historians, thus it transpired there was a more serious aspect to this experience. Consequently, I became the more focused upon the fact that the corollary of primogeniture, not so much taxation, was the underlying and more compelling emotive and divisive issue that led to the colonial quarrel into rebellion. The Quebec Act of 1774, signed at the end of the 7 Years' War, whereby the British agreed with the French that they would not exceed their boundary beyond the Ohio River, curtailed the availability of land in the context of the New World land rush. Such was the pressure as boatload after boatload of second and third sons weighed anchor with the expectation that rose from the abundance of cheap land in America to which they would have been precluded in England. As Gage himself observed, the people themselves have gradually retired from the coast. They are already almost out of reach of law and government. Next. After the Pyrrhic victory at the Battle of Bunker, or Breed's Hill, on 17th June 1775, Thomas was recalled to London in October. The pretext that he was required in England to help lay plans for major operations in 1776. Margaret had left earlier. Gage followed, never to return to America. When General Howe took over as Commander-in-Chief, this resulted in a marked change in tenor, as well as a watershed as to the fate of the colonies. The person who was at heart had the greater interest in finding a peaceful and conciliatory way forward, especially having fought in some of the bloodiest battles of his day, was replaced by those with a fixed professional mindset. Next. And this is where I have to thank Mary. This was a personal of great personal anguish both for Thomas and Margaret. At the early stage of his administration, Gage had vested enormous resourcefulness and belief into the making of the New World. He was a colonial landowner, had spent the majority of his life in North America. By marriage, he had relatives and friends in America. Most of his children were born there. Following the Americans' victory at Yorktown in 1776, Lord North fell from power. Gage's political enemies were forced to retire in 1782. Thomas was subsequently promoted to become a full general for his services in the colonies, together with the fact that his recommendations for sufficient reinforcements had never been heeded. Next. It appeared that Thomas continued to be held in real affection in America. This may be demonstrated by the fact that he was allowed to retain his land in New York State when most loyalist properties were confiscated. Next. Returning to London, Thomas purchased a house at 1779 at what is now 41 Portland Place. After the war, life in the colonies was difficult for loyalists. Many were exposed to threats, often extreme, also confiscation of property. Margaret's older brother, Samuel, came to London in 1783, becoming a merchant, followed by brother Stephen. Cousins, such as Lieutenant Colonel Philip Van Cortlandt and his wife Catherine Ogden from New Jersey, settled in Sussex via Nova Scotia in order to escape intolerable conditions in which they were faced. Next, they lived in Van Cortlandt Manor in Hailsham within the domain of the Firle estate, where he became barrack master, controlling troops in readiness for a possible invasion by Napoleon's army. There is a memorial to him in the church where he is buried. Next. There's the memorial, thank you. Next. Before I pass over to the microphone to Mary, I would like to touch upon two documents at Firle that were personal to Gage and not included in the papers, purchased by Mr. Clements, remaining thus in our family possession for over 250 years. In fact, I was fascinated to read a letter that Cheney showed me from the 6th Viscount Gage, saying that these were so personal to the family that he did want them to remain. Shortly before Boston, in 1773, after serving for nearly 20 years in America without vacation, Gage applied for a leave of absence because of affairs of my family which require my presence for some time in England. Doubtless, he wished to see his brother again, with whom he was very close, as well as to meet his sister-in-law. Margaret was eager to meet her husband's English relatives, and both would have been keen to visit their children at school. Next, they set sail upon the Earl of Dartmouth on June 18th, 1773, and they were greeted triumphantly upon their arrival. At this point, he was a hero. Their departure was sincerely regretted within the colonies, since it was possible that Gage might not return. The unequivocal esteem with which he was held was demonstrated at a New York dinner given by the mayor and council the day before their departure. As a token of affection and respect, he was granted the Freedom of New York, which I have just shown you. While the document remains in the family possession, next, the gold box in which it would have been folded and placed for presentation for Thomas is now in a private collection in Monaco. The Freedom Box was made by the Huguenot Otto Paul de Parisien. Given the very short notice at which the Gage's departure was announced, a recent discovery of Parisien family correspondent indicates there may not have been sufficient gold in the city for the box. It appears the goldsmith and his wife melted down their wedding bands in order to make up the last drops to make the difference. Next. Secondly, the 1766 Fair Draft Plan of the City of New York, and we were delighted to welcome Mary to New York, to Firle last year, which began this adventure, whereby I received the invitation to come here to Ann Arbor, which began its life as an official document and subsequently came to be embellished as an intended gift on the part of Colonel John Montresor. It stands as testimony to two men whose lives were intertwined when they set off independently for North America in 1754 to serve under General Braddock during the 7 Years' War, through the fall of Quebec in 1759 to the eve of the American Revolutionary War, finally becoming neighbours in London. As Mary Pedley will point out shortly, the map functions first as a personal homage to the Commander-in-Chief who had requested it, and could have a role in Montresor's own advancement, because General Gage's job was to open up the West, and you need map makers. Second, as a document that mixes the depiction of the terrain with places of personal significance to the Gages, highlighted in ink, next, the obelisk to the memory of James Wolfe and fallen comrades, and estates throughout Lower Manhattan that belonged to Margaret Gage's relations. The estate that really stands out is that of Admiral Sir Peter Warren, married to Margaret's cousin, Susanna de Lancey. Admiral Warren, from an Irish Catholic family, though he turned to Protestantism because he couldn't join the Navy as a Catholic, was one of the most imaginative officers in the history of the British Navy. Next. He played a key role in the defense and expansion of British naval power in colonial America. Warren cruised up and down the North American coast from one theater of conflict to another. Shares in prize money from enemy ships captured in the battle were the chief inducement in the 18th century for the men of the Royal Navy to hazard their lives at sea. Warren's prize fortunes was one of the largest accumulated by a naval officer before the 7 Years' War. Susanna's father was the Huguenot Stephen de Lancey of the leading New York merchant family. Thus Peter became integrated into the social and commercial life and money lending on land, as well as a prominent property owner through Lady Warren, who bought the largest estate in Manhattan in her dowry that later became Greenwich Village. Next. The Warrens had 6 children. Another Susanna married Lieutenant General William Skinner, the brother of Loyalist General Cortlandt Skinner. Both were grandsons of Stephanus Van Cortlandt. Lady Warren died in 1771. The following year, the Skinners brought out his wife's 2 sisters' interest in Westbury House in Hampshire. Next. Which in fact was the Warrens' estate in England. Thereby, Susanna owned the entire estate. She married Henry Gage in 1789, son of General Gage, who subsequently became the 3rd Viscount Gage. Once again, Henry and Susanna's marriage provides an intriguing insight into the close kinship of the Empire families. Through Henry's mother, Margaret Ney Kemble, this made Susanna Skinner and Henry Gage second cousins and third cousins via Susanna Warren. Next. Thomas has been criticized by historians for being somewhat slow to anticipate the signs that would result in the armed conflict and loss of colonies. My own reading is that he was patient and a conciliator rather than a warmonger. The fact that Montresor chose to emphasize the proximity of Thomas's in-laws living in the vicinity of their home in Broad Street provides insights. As staunch loyalists, they may well have sought to reassure Thomas when the riots broke out in New York. Worry not, this was just a flash in the pan and would go away. Could this have been the aspect that contributed to his lack of indecisiveness at the time, or decisiveness to wait to see how events played themselves out? Thomas kept the correspondence pertaining to his position of Commander-in-Chief filed by way of at the end of each year in Pine document cases, which appeared to have been numbered consecutively. The reference on this case that we have at Firle would have referred to his military secretaries. One, next please, Gabriel Mathurin, who had distinguished himself in action with his regiment in the Battle of Quebec, was Gage's military secretary from 1760, as such the general's closest aide and effectively his chief of staff. Mathurin married Mary Livingston, providing, of course, a link of kinship with Margaret's family. Both sat for Copley in 1771, subscribing to the New York invitation to the artist arranged by Stephen Kemble. Thomas sailed to England at the end of 1775 with 12 cases containing some 21,000 documents. Cheney will talk about their purchase by William Clements from the 6th Viscount Gage in 1930. A case dated 1768 returned to Firle, which we purchased at Christie's in New York at the auction of the contents of the Lindens belonging to Mr. and Mrs. Morris Morris, next, in January 1983. The Lindens, next, was built in 1754 by Robert King Hooper in Danvers, Massachusetts, considered one of the foremost colonial homes in New England, which General Gage rented briefly for use as his home and headquarters between June to September 1774. The Morrises purchased the Lindens in 1934, which was under threat resulting from development, and they moved it to Kalorama Circle in Washington, D.C., in which Miriam then filled the house with a period collection. A note in Christie's catalogue states that our 1768 box was presented to George Morris Morris after speaking at an engagement in Michigan University. Thus, its presence in the Great Hall at Firle today provides an appropriate link with the William Clements Library across the pond in Michigan. Thomas would be very pleased by this connection, and I have to say he would be touched by the care, the fact that his papers are all together and the care with which they have been looked after and are proudly shared, as will be the case with their digitalization here in Ann Arbor. So thank you for making it their home.
Thank you, Deborah, very much for that and for the friendship we've been able to share in sharing our research and sharing the lore of the Gages. I'm going to talk very briefly about the map that Deborah mentioned, which is what we call the map kept behind. And a facsimile of this map is on display at the far end of this room. I hope before you leave today that you have a chance to see it. It's at roughly the same size as the map that's kept at Firle Place in Sussex. As Deborah has pointed out, in the autumn of 1765, Thomas Gage asked one of his engineers, John Montresor, to make him a map of Lower Manhattan. When the Gage papers came to Ann Arbor, that map, shown here, stayed behind in Firle Place in Sussex. And building on research done by Deborah, I hope to explain to you today why it was kept behind by looking at it closely and asking those basic questions we ask of all primary sources in history. And first of all is the where. The map shows the southern point of Manhattan Island tilted slightly to the northeast. It includes, as I've circled, the street plan of the small city of New York, whose population was about 15,000 at this time, and 3 square miles of countryside, going, as the title tells us, to Greenwich on the north or Hudson's River, and to Crown Point on the Sound of the East River. Each of those places was about an hour's walk from the city, 3 miles, And here, just to help you orient yourself, is an overlay of a Google map of the same area so that you can kind of tell where you are in southern Manhattan. Now, the next question we have to ask is when? There's no date on this map. It was presented to Gage in March of 1766. And that was a significant moment, as Deborah has pointed out, in New York history, because at that time the city was the scene of violent unrest in reaction to the Stamp Act, a tax imposed by London's Parliament to raise money to support the British Army in North America. Now, this Stamp Act required all newspapers, all legal documents, all printed material like playing cards, even dice, to carry a revenue stamp like these, or to be printed on stamped paper. And General Gage was responsible for the security of the ships carrying the stamps to New York and for their storage in the city. We now turn to the who. We've learned a lot about Thomas Gage tonight, and he and John Montresor, who is also shown here in a portrait by John Singleton Copley, were about 16 years apart in age. Gage was the senior of the two, but they shared much in common. They both attended the same school in London, Westminster. They arrived in North America at the same time, place, and for the same purpose, as we've heard, to join in that expedition to Fort Duquesne against the French in 1755, where they were both injured in that bloody ambush. And throughout the French and Indian War, they served together in New York and Canada, officer and engineer, so they were very well acquainted. Obviously, they were both painted by John Singleton Copley in very distinct ways. Here you see John Montresor as the man of action with his arm resting on a stump of wood. Carpentry was very important in the building of fortresses, not to mention the pine boxes that Gage was keeping his documents in. And he's holding in his hand a translation of a French text of The Field Engineer, a kind of how-to book of his craft. Another thing they have in common was that they both married wealthy Americans, also painted by Copley. Here you have Margaret Kemble on the left. You've already seen her. John Montresor married a woman called Frances Tucker, who was an heiress to the Bermuda Tuckers, and whose mother was a Nichols, a very famous name in New York City history. They both had 10 children. Montresor named one of his sons Thomas Gage Montresor. With large families, they both desired land in North America, and so like Gage, Montresor's father James, also an engineer, had acquired lands in upstate New York, and Montresor himself bought an island in the East River, which he named Montresor Island. It's now part of Randall's Island in the East River. And when Montresor returned to England, he lived near Gage on Portland Place in London. So we turn now to the how and the what, mapping Manhattan. Montresor kept prolific notebooks and journals throughout his life, and one of them describes the winter of 1766 and his survey of New York City and environs during the Stamp Act riots. To map the city, he could easily rely on a plan like this plan, which was by a city surveyor and printed in New York 10 years earlier. Here I'm showing you, for ease of looking at it, a republished version from London from 1763. It shows the old Dutch fort at the tip of Manhattan and the main wharf nearby, where the ships with stamped paper would arrive. And these stamps then had to be stored in the fort. So we'll zoom in a little bit and see exactly where the Gages lived on Broad Street, just up the street from the mansion of Margaret's great-grandfather, Van Cortlandt, next to the Exchange. And now we're going to listen to Montresor himself describe the arrival of those stamps on that ship on the 31st of October, 1765. This night, a mob in 3 squads went through the streets crying, "Liberty!" at the same time breaking lamps and threatening that they would the next night pull down their houses. Major James was threatened to be buried for commanding the troops in the fort for the protection of the stamps. November 1st. This night, the rabble, or rather the rebels, assembled again early in the evening and continued the riot till 4 this morning, their numbers about 2,000, during which time they broke open the governor's house and then took out his chariot and 2 sleighs and a chair, which they burnt on the bowling green with effigies and gallows. Some attempted to get over the walls of the fort, menacing the troops. Now you can tell that in this moment, Montresor's concern as an engineer was to strengthen the structure of Fort George, which guarded the approach to the city, was protecting the stamps. But in December, General Gage asked Montresor for maps of the province of New York, and one particularly of the environs of the city. Montresor reported that there were none available, so Gage asked him to sketch him a plan of this place on a large scale, with its environs and adjacent country together with its harbor, but particularly to show the ground to the north and northeast of the town. And we can see here one of Montresor's early sketches in his survey, which he began in the middle of December 1765. And this survey sketch shows Bowery Lane leading north out of the city. And he worked at this scale and on these kind of sketches for the next 2 months, quietly and unobtrusively amid the riots by the Liberty Boys. He wrote in January, "I waited on General Gage and showed him my bouillon, my early draft, that he might see the progress I had made on the survey. I received his thanks for the above and continued on my survey sub rosa, as observations might endanger one's house and effects, if not one's life." In early February, he assembled his surveys onto a very large map, which he then reduced to half scale. This became what he called his fair draft in ink and wash in manuscript. It measures about 30 inches by 21 inches, ready to present to General Gage in March 1766. Now, Montresor's fair draft displays exactly what the general asked for, to show the ground to the north and northeast of town, that is, for the lie of the land. The focus here is not on the city, whose streets and buildings are unnamed, but the environment whose elevations are depicted with what we call hatchering. Hatchering is a method of shading using short, straight lines to show slope. And the closer the lines, the steeper the slope. It highlights high ground, always advantageous for military purposes, and it could be sketched quickly in the field without measurements. As Gage requested, the map's cartographic energy draws you towards the areas north and east of the city, where we're about to take a little tour. We'll start and look closely at 4 places along the way. Bowery Lane, we've seen the rough sketch of that, and we'll look and see what it looks like on the map. And on the road, we'll move up towards that obelisk, and then to Greenwich itself, which is just a small enclave of houses, returning along the Hudson River to the city. So as we go up Bowery Lane, the first thing we encounter is not only the elevations of the 2 large hills, as you see right in the center where the dark hatchering is, but we also find the estates of James Delancey, one of Margaret Kemble's cousins, a past lieutenant governor of the province of New York. And across the road, another cousin, Nicholas Bayard. As we move up the road, going north, we see the estate of Lady Warren, Susanna Delancey, yet another cousin, wife of Sir Peter Warren, whom we've heard about. We move towards Greenwich, and we see, first of all, the obelisk. The obelisk was erected to the memory of General James Wolfe and those who fell at the Siege of Quebec in 1759, at which Montresor was present. It was on the property of Oliver Delancey, yet another cousin, who became a Loyalist brigadier general of New York in the Revolution. Next door was another cousin, William Bayard, and next to him, the estate of Abraham Mortier, friend of the Gages, wealthy loyalist, and deputy paymaster for the British Army. Returning to the city, we encounter the full range of topographical features of elevated land, cultivated fields, boggy valleys, and formal gardens, all focusing on the advantages and pitfalls of natural features. Now, although this map was made with some haste and sub rosa, Montresor spent extra time on the fair draft for General Gage. The Rococo frame of the title cartouche is matched by its very florid lettering that you can see here. And that, too, is a style which continues in the lettering of the river. Yet engineering precision is also shown in the scale of the map, which is given not only in miles, it's a 1 mile scale, but also in yards. And you can see the extremely fine delineation right down to 40 yards. Finally, Montresor's artistic skills are on full display in the dedication to Gage, with its soldier wearing the uniform of the 22nd Regiment of Foot, of which Gage was colonel. It includes the distinctive mitred hat of the Grenadiers, with its Roman numeral XXII 22 on it and the small pom-pom at the top. And the Grenadiers of the 22nd were very important in the Battle of Quebec. They were known as the Louisbourg Grenadiers, and they played a significant role in that battle and in that victory. Thus, the plan of the city of New York and its environs is both a military sketch and a very personal document for the Gage family, emphasizing family connections, bucolic settings, fertile rolling countryside, a land whose potential rents and profits held great allure for the general and his engineer. So no wonder it was kept behind when the Gage papers left Sussex to come to Michigan. And I turn you over now to Cheney Choperet, who will tell us about that journey. Thanks.
I will. Thank you. Good evening. Thank you, everybody, for being here this evening. Right, to conclude the evening's conversations, we're going to talk about paperwork and bureaucracy, specifically about the approximately 23,000 manuscripts and printed items comprising the Thomas Gage papers that are now at the Clements Library. I want to share with you something of the history of the papers as they made their way from colonial America to England and back to America again. And I will end with some remarks about the Clements Library's work to digitize them for free and open access. For those of you unfamiliar with the Thomas Gage papers, they are letters and letter books, documents, journals, minutes. They are printed broadsides, official acts, certificates, vouchers, accounts, summaries, warrants, bills of lading, bills of exchange, agreements, contracts, orders, military reports, intelligence. There's also petitions, notes, memoranda, drafts, and bundles. They are in the handwriting of the authors as well as those of secretaries. There are contemporary copies, duplicates, triplicates, first originals, second originals, true copies, as well as fair ones. We could go on. That's not a complete list of any of those categories. But what it is all paperwork. And papers can bring us intimately close to the individual people that created them and the activities they were involved in, the places where they wrote from, their relationships and organizations, their physical everyday lives and activities, and the changing natural world around them. Now, the Thomas Gage papers date primarily from 1763 to 1775 while serving as Commander-in-Chief of the British Army in North America, And as Deborah Gage indicated, he had an extraordinary geographical area to manage, and that required communication through paperwork. And that paperwork, that documentation, required careful organization by the secretaries who assisted and worked for Thomas Gage, because they were working papers. They were papers he was using at the time that they were created. And this is an image of one of the 12 campaign chests, the secretarial chests that Gage kept with him and his secretaries maintained. Most of them had 2 rows of pigeonholes, which were marked by, and you can see on the right, many of them didn't survive, but the ones that do indicate geographical areas, posts. For London, they would include. They stated simply which department they were to go to: the Treasury Office, to the War Office. There was a separate set of correspondence to William Barrington at his private home, and so on. So Gage kept growing his body of papers over the course of nearly 10 years at his Broad Street headquarters in New York, from 1763 to 73. And then the papers moved to the Province House in Boston, his office at Danvers, and back to Boston, and also in 1774. And when he boarded the ship Pallas on October 11th of 1775 for his return voyage to England, he took his papers with them, as at the time it was common practice for politicians and military officers to take their papers home with them as part of their own possessions. And that's the case in the United States as well until later in our history as in the United States. This list on the left shows how the materials break down in their housing here at the Clements. So it's an extraordinary volume of materials. This is a work in progress of a map showing the movement of the papers physically from Gage's various headquarters back to England. A current investigation will hopefully reveal where Gage took his papers on return. There's a variety of different places that he went immediately on his return. I have correspondence from him at High Meadow in December of 1775. Did they go to his London address, or perhaps did they go to be kept at the Viscount Gage's Firle place? On Gage's death in 1787, did they move with Margaret to her new home on Arlington Street in London? Some combination of those various ways? I don't know exactly, but that some research will hopefully unravel. But we do know that by 1911, Gage's papers, still in their original secretarial trunks, were physically at Firle. This we know because a military chaplain and rector in residence in Sussex named Henry Belcher published a book that year titled The First American Civil War. And in it, he expresses his gratitude to the man on the left for providing him access to the Gage papers at Firle, Henry Reynold Gage, the 6th Viscount Gage, who was himself a military man, having served in World War I, the Great War, as part of the Coldstream Guards. His litany of positions and achievements I won't list here, only to say that at the time, he was the chief owner of the papers when Henry Belcher consulted them. So news of the existence of the Gage papers through that publication allowed the knowledge of their existence to grow. And by 1924, the 6th Viscount approved a request for the Historical Manuscripts Commission to take the papers to the Public Record Office in London to be assessed and have photostats made. There, American historians Clarence Carter and Alan French accessed them and brought them to the attention of the man on the right. Most of you here likely know the appearance of William Lawrence Clements, the founder of the William Clements Library at the University of Michigan. For those of you who don't know, Mr. Clements graduated from the university with a degree in mechanical engineering, and he gained considerable wealth in the design and manufacture of machinery for large-scale construction projects. And with that wealth, he set to work building a collection of primary source printed materials and later manuscripts and prints focused on the subject of the Americas between the 15th and 18th centuries. So by the time William Clements wrote his first letter to Henry Reinald Gage in 1929, he had already made the Clements Library a pivotal destination for original research on the American Revolutionary War era. On the shelves in Ann Arbor, the papers of William Petty, the 2nd Earl of Shelburne, who, among many political positions, served as Secretary of the Southern Department in the 1760s and as Prime Minister during the peace negotiations that ended the American Revolution in 1783. And you can actually see those in that portrait of Mr. Clements. Beside his left elbow, those shelves those are volumes, very distinct volumes from the Shelburne papers. And at that time, in Mr. Clements' personal library in Bay City, were the papers of Sir Henry Clinton, who commanded the British Army for some half of the Revolutionary War, papers of Nathaniel Greene, Washington's general, Under Secretary of the Colonies William Knox, and many more. So over the course of 1929, Mr. Clements attempted to connect with the Viscount to discuss the possible sale of the Gage papers. His initial letter does not appear to have received a response. V.C. Clinton Baddeley, of the family of Henry Clinton descendants, knew Henry Reinald and encouraged him to converse with Mr. Clements. These two men met in person in 1929, that is, the two men you see here, and by the end of the year had come to a verbal agreement about the sale of the papers for £20,000, with details still to be fleshed out. Interestingly, newspapers caught wind of it, and in January of 1930 began publishing articles celebrating Mr. Clements' acquisition. Now, Mr. Clements and Randolph Adams, the first director of the Clements Library, were quite frustrated with this. And that's because no contract had been signed, as the 6th Viscount was then in India, working there as part of, as under Foreign Secretary. Competitors read newspapers, and most notably in this case would be A. W. Rosenbach, who was a very savvy, sometimes friend, sometimes foe in the competitive market with Mr. Clements and other collectors. So, without a contract sign, an opportunity for wealthier contemporary collectors, such as Henry Huntington, to step in and offer more money was a possibility. There were plenty with deeper pockets than Mr. Clements. So Adams and Mr. Clements frantically sought out the date that the Viscount would return to England in order to finalize the transaction. This is Randolph Adams at the train station in Ann Arbor, waiting for the train to take him to New York, where he will take a fairly recently built steamer that was built for steam, the SS Bremen, to make his way over to Southampton, London, and Firle. He left on March 13th of 1930. To his right, incidentally, in the right picture, is our first manuscripts curator, Edna Vosper. One important aspect of the sale is the role of the Honorable Yvonne Rosamond Gage, sister of the Viscount. She was a bibliographer, a family historian, and the woman foremost in charge of the papers. As Dr. Adams shared in the letter to the right, the Viscount, quote, won't do anything until she says it is all right, end quote. Carefully withholding family papers, Yvonne Gage personally saw that Mr. Clements received the 7 Years' War letter books that, if you've consulted the Gage papers at the Clements, you will have seen. They're the large volumes of his outgoing correspondence, Gage's outgoing correspondence. On March 27th of 1930, the contract was signed, insurance was paid, and the U.S. Senator from Michigan, Arthur Vandenberg, made special customs arrangements to prevent any potential damage that customs agents might do to the arrangement or to the physical condition of the materials. The Gage papers made their way to New York, Ann Arbor, and then Bay City. The final leg of the papers' journey followed after Mr. Clements' death in 1934. The collector had promised the papers to his library at the University of Michigan, but the Great Depression had prevented him from gifting them. Detroit philanthropist Tracy McGregor stepped in to pay the Clements estate, and finally in 1937, the Gage papers arrived. We're going to leap ahead to the 21st century, where the Clements Library has been enthusiastically working on a project to digitize the Gage papers. We are extremely grateful to the National Endowment for the Humanities for the grant awarded to that effort. We decided to remove the manuscripts from the large red volumes into which they were tipped in 1940s with funding from the Daughters of the American Revolution. They were exceptionally beautiful volumes with wonderfully heavy paper, and they did well for us over the years. Unfortunately, pages are highly acidic, and we decided to, we had wanted to remove them for a while to get them into a long-term housing that would be safe for them. This gave us a good opportunity. 3 NEH-funded digitization technicians, additional technicians, and graduate student assistants scanned or photographed each page of the collection, including all dockets, address covers, wrappers, and blank pages at 600 PPI and FADGI standards. Each image includes a color correction target measuring device. After capturing images, they are cropped and color corrected. Around 95,000 images is the estimated total of the whole collection, though we haven't determined the final number, so plus or minus. The digitization technicians filled a spreadsheet with information about each manuscript in the collection, applied titles, dates, writers, recipients, geography, technical information, docket information, the way that that particular piece was sent, if it indicated what ship it was on, what ship captain, and so on. And much more. The digitization team is in the last stages of those spreadsheets, cleaning up data, editing for accuracy, and otherwise making the metadata ready to go online. I am regularly asked, as are my colleagues at the Clements, when the next batch of volumes will go online. We do have several dozen volumes ready to go, which we will be submitting to our amazing colleagues at Digital Content and Collections, our partners who work to get our materials up and preserve them over and into the future. So we anticipating, since we have a full-time digital technician right now working on editing metadata, we anticipate that we'll be putting up new digital content with more rapidity than we have since the very first launch of the website. So thank you very much for your patience in that regard. We are as excited as you. Lastly, I would like to add that our digitization team has been utilizing artificial intelligence models to read handwriting, to produce searchable transcriptions of the Gage papers. We trained a model on Thomas Gage's secretary's English roundhand using Transcribus, and then found that running the results through Transcription Perl has given us something that we feel comfortable sending out into the world. with an important disclaimer about errors, because as you can imagine, in 23,000-ish letters written by many by different people, some of whom aren't secretaries, certainly there are curveballs in there, so some of them may not come out quite right. So thank you, everyone who's helped in the digitization process. You're all amazing. So, and thank you all for being here. Okay. And that's them.
I would like to make clear that I am not one of the people who ever asks Cheney when the next volumes are going to be digitized, because I know they will be up when they are good and ready. As our speakers move up to the front, if people have questions on index cards, please pass them down to the end, just like you're giving an offering in church, and they will bring them up to me. Thank you. So please, if other questions come up, please feel free to pass them down. The first question is, when it is said that Britain incurred a huge debt as a result of the French and Indian War, where did they borrow the money from?
Sorry, could you repeat that question?
Sure. When it is said that Britain incurred a huge debt as a result of the French and Indian War, where did they get that money?
Where Benjamin Franklin.
Oh, pass the microphone down there.
Sorry.
Where Benjamin Franklin got it from, the Dutch.
The Dutch. Can always count on the Dutch to have piles of money. This is a question for perhaps for Cheney or for Deborah. Does the collection include lists of conscripts to General Howe's army in 1775?
Conscripts.
Conscripts to General Howe's army. Would that include, when did the Hessians come?
That is a question that I don't have immediately at the top of my head, but it is absolutely something that I can find out for you. So please do touch base with me after. I'm happy to take a look and see what shows up in the papers for those. So.
This is a question probably for Cheney and for Deborah. What was General Gage's role in responding to Pontiac's rebellion and the proclamation of 1763?
So I'll say, and I'll try and focus again on the papers. Thomas Gage is in New York, and he is managing that affair, all of the various operations related to it from afar. So he is corresponding with John Bradstreet and others who are further west and headed towards and near Detroit. I was actually just showing Deborah yesterday one of the pieces that in the Gage papers that I find particularly compelling, which is Bradstreet made an agreement with a group of Native American delegates that he did not have the authority to do. And the original agreement by Bradstreet is in the Gage papers, including the two crosses, the signature of Kayasuda, and it is, every time I look through them and see those, I should finish before I start gushing about how emotional it is to be with the pieces, the original thing that was passed along. Gage rarely wrote drafts, he often dictated, but when things were particularly important, he would write them in draft form and then have them copied and revised. For his response to Bradstreet after making that agreement, he wrote a draft, and it is an exceptionally vicious draft. He's very upset about the way in which that agreement, which is a peace agreement, is very much problematic because of the effects that that has on larger relations with different tribes in other places. And Bradstreet, not being privy to that information, was really making a difficult time for Gage in New York. So he writes a draft of this letter, which is almost ungentlemanly in its approach. And following that is a draft, or the retained copy of the letter he sent to him, which is cleaned up considerably and is quite gentlemanly, and is still exceedingly firm. But it reminds me very much of the read what you've written before you hit send sort of thing, where the effects of that, sort of his immediate response, would have been problematic. And so he titled that out. That's not an exact response to your answer about the broad scope of what's there, but if you can imagine somebody managing the whole project, it's there. There are inventory lists of clothing that was given to the men and women who were returned to the eastern seaboard, many of whom had been living with tribes for years. Oh, look at that. And so there's just a great deal of both data and there's people that are represented throughout the 63, 64, and into 65 after that. So.
This is a question for Deborah, I think. We talked about this a bit at dinner last night. Do any Gage descendants live on the family New York property? And can you talk a bit about what happened to the land that the Gage family owned in New York?
Yes. Well, as I mentioned, because of the fondness with which people held for Thomas Gage, essentially he had purchased 18,000 acres just outside Albany, and that land they were able to keep. And then, of course, you've got Henry Gage, third Viscount, marrying Susanna, who inherits a great deal of land from her grandparents, Admiral and Lady Warren. And what's interesting is that after a while, reading through the letters, particularly to his uncle Stephen, there's a great flurry to sell land. And at first I didn't understand it. In fact, we had this little conversation. And then suddenly reading the correspondence, I realized that the attitudes are hardening against loyalists. And there was a good chance that the land that both he and Susanna owned would be sequestered. So they're selling it very quickly at whatever price they can get. So no Gages of our family earn any land any longer. I must say, a friend of mine in a little house in Greenwich Village.
Did the British always wear red uniforms and formal clothes to indicate their nationality? And if so, why? Since it would make them rather obvious.
Because the
I
French
probably
were blue.
begin to explain that. It wasn't just the British who wore red uniforms. I mean, this actually goes back to the days of old Crusades, and being able to recognise people in terms of their uniforms and the pendants that they wore in their helmets. So it was more to recognise your uniform, but. I gave a very interesting lecture at the Philosophical Society in Philadelphia, and there was a person who knew about guns. And in the 18th century, those flintlock guns were hopeless, couldn't hit a target. And so the reason that they all stood in a long straight line was because they were given the order to fire, and they all fired together, and then there was just a wall of lead. Some of which hit its mark. But that was they were always criticised for standing in a long straight line, because then, of course, the Minutemen could pick them off. But as you also heard in my lecture, understanding this new way of fighting, it was General Gage who then invented his own regiment where they wore camouflage coats and black buttons. So they
wouldn't be so conspicuous.
Cheney, we have, this is kind of an easy one. What will be done with the original documents after digitization?
They will be safe and housed in climate-controlled environment. Every once in a while, we'll go down, we'll play some peaceful music. They will be, of course, retained. As you know, our primary purpose is the acquisition and preservation into the future of the primary sources themselves. The digitization efforts are very much for the purpose of access, research, the ability to get that information out of the building and into the scholarship and the writing and the interest of anyone free of charge that has internet access. I mean, that's the goal for us. It's very much about access, and it also there are side notes, but that's 90.5% of it. So,
and I would add a question I get asked all the time is once we digitize a collection, does that mean people are going to stop coming to look at it? Which is absolutely not the case. My experience through working in libraries like the Clements over the years is that the more you digitize, the more attention collections get and the more people want to come see things. And just because things are available online doesn't mean that there aren't things you can't learn from looking at the physical letters or books. And so I expect that the digitization of the Gage papers, once everything is available, that will only increase interest in seeing the original items. We have a question, did Gage have correspondence with Cornwallis, and if so, is it in the collection?
I believe there is at least one letter of Cornwallis's in the collection. It's in the earlier 1760s. I can't, off the top of my head, remember the content, I'm afraid. But there is that, at least one. So we can, again, please do feel free to, with any specifics about individual pieces. If I don't know them off the top of my head, I can certainly find out for you.
This question, I think for you, Deborah, how were the Gage papers stored in England during the time that they were held there? And is there a significance of the 14 compartments in the document chests, or is that just an artifact of the construction process?
I think that's a fact of the construction process. I actually think, just to respond to your side, I actually think when Gage sailed back to England, they rented a house for a year before they bought their house at 41 Portland Square. And I think the documents remained with them the entire time. And then after Thomas dies, Margaret plus one of their daughters moves into a house in Dover Street. And then I sensed there was a sort of moment of chaos, probably when she died, because all of a sudden we've got Copleys turning up in the house, and in fact there's not room for them. And so they sort of go into back corridors, and over time they get forgotten that they're Copleys, and later on become attributed to the hand of Nathaniel Dance. And I hate to tell you, but the papers went up into the attic. And in fact, one of the reasons that my cousin, my great-uncle, decided to sell them was that Yvonne said, they're going to get eaten up by the rats if they stay here. So, because sort of English country house doesn't have the facilities for storing what have now proved to be very valuable documents. That one of the reasons for this decision was that they knew that they were beautifully cared for, as has been the case. And now I think this system of digitalization is incredibly exciting.
Did Thomas Gage write anything about the conflict in the French and Indian War, particularly the ambush in western Pennsylvania, and was he close to Braddock when Braddock was killed?
Do you know more about? Okay, that's one that that I'm going to have to come back to. I don't know off the top of my head.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. Based on his papers, what was General Gage's feeling about being removed from his position of Commander-in-Chief?
You know, it's interesting, and this is actually a little bit timely because I was curious. Actually, last night I was looking through some of the papers that followed in October and November of 1775 to see if I could get an idea about exactly that question, because I didn't really know the answer if anything was in there, because it's oftentimes, and we were talking about this, Deborah, was it's hard to find Gage as a person in the papers.
But that's because
you
they're official.
They're official papers,
Yeah.
so you can get some of it though through the actions and decisions and the things that they do, but hearing his voice tell that is not the sort of thing that's typically in these official papers. And so as I was going through those last though, there was one piece that really caught my eye, and it is a letter that he wrote while at sea on the trip back to England. And it's a letter addressed to the ministers, providing them with some of his own, it's not advice, it's more of a sort of a thoughtful reflection on what they might consider as they decide what to do next. If I had it transcribed, I would read it to you, but it's very much cautionary, because from his experiences, he found that the people that were, fomenting and beginning the revolution were not going to be people who would engage in peace conversations. He really didn't think that would happen in that letter at that time. And I don't know what it was like to be him leaving his home for the last how many years to return. But that would be a piece to look at if you were interested in what he was thinking as he left. And I don't know if you have anything to add.
Well, I think the war was misunderstood, as we talked about at dinner last night. When I took part in the 225th reenactment of Lexington Concord, and as I say, to me, it was a complete eye-opener, because all those reenactors are historians, and what they pointed out to me was that really what this war was all about, it wasn't about taxation without representation. It was a land. It was all about land, if you were the eldest son, you could own land in England, but you couldn't own land in America. General Gage was the second son. He came, he could own land. He had a future there. And the trouble was that you had every day these ships landing in New York and Boston, and second and third sons coming out, and the British, because of the 1774 signing the Treaty of Quebec, had agreed with the French that they wouldn't go any further than the Ohio River. They were running out of land. George Washington was already across and said, there's plenty of land here. And the British government was saying, you can't do this, you can't have that land. That was what it was all about. And I think that General Gage understood that because he owned land. And that's what they didn't understand in England.
We have one final question, which is for you, Deborah. Is there a particularly special family treasure that is still being passed down in the family since the 1770s?
Well, I think the two documents that remained behind we find incredibly moving. You have to remember when he sailed home after his having been in America for 20 years and was given the freedom of the city of New York, he was loved and people were very sorry to see him go. because he contributed an enormous amount. He realized the value of building ports and roads for the prosperity of the country, opening up the West. And he returned to England he was a hero, a rapturous welcome. And, when he sailed home, finally to be stripped of his title and was jeered and sneered at, it must have been a very difficult time. But those two documents that we have, Freedom of the City of New York and the map, to us are great treasures, because I think that it speaks about how he felt about America, what he did for America. And it was because I wanted to find out more about the map that I was introduced to Mary. And now, I know, now that we know even more about the map, we're going to treasure the map some more. Thank you, Mary. And I have to say, I've loved my conversation with Cheney too. So it's been a wonderful collaboration to be continued.
No.
Please join me in thanking our speakers this evening. And I just want to note that I am deeply proud to work at the Clements Library, at an institution that not only holds such wonderful collections, but takes such excellent care of those collections. And all of you who live in the state of Michigan should be proud of that too, because this collection is an absolute treasure, and has changed how we understand the origins of this country and will continue to do so. I want to leave you with two parting notes about upcoming programs. On Friday, April 18th, in recognition of the 250th anniversary of the start of the American Revolutionary War and the Battle of Lexington and Concord, we will open a new exhibit at the Clements Library titled Bloody Work, Lexington and Concord, 1775. Among the items on display will be Thomas Gage's draft orders for the Concord expedition, a bundle of letters collected by former Sons of Liberty supporter Dr. Benjamin Church, which he secretly turned over to the British Army, as well as some materials from a private collection that I don't think have ever been shown before. So please come see this exhibit. It's going to be really fantastic. And lastly, I hope you'll join us on May 13th at 4:30 p.m. for a conversation with Pulitzer Prize-winning author Rick Atkinson. He'll be discussing his new book, Fate of the Day, The War for America, Fort Ticonderoga to Charleston, 1777 to 1780. This is the second volume of his trilogy on the history of the Revolution. That program will take place in the Robertson Auditorium at the Ross Business School. So please join us then as well. Thank you for coming.